Good morning to all the participants from various colleges. On behalf of Departments of Economics and Banking of Symbiosis College of Arts and Commerce, I, Ms. Diya Devare, welcome you all to the second day of the webinar on understanding the economic consequences of COVID-19. I now request the Principal of Symbiosis College of Arts and Commerce, Dr. Rishikesh Soman, to address the participants.
Hello. बोलू मी. Hello. Good morning, and I welcome you all for the second day of this webinar. Today's speaker, Dr. Ashish Kulkarni, has been associated with our college for quite some time, and we are happy to have him here to talk on monetary policy. This particular webinar is organized by the Department of Economics and Banking of our college, and I'm very happy to say that yes, yesterday and today the entire response is very encouraging and welcoming. I must congratulate and put on record the efforts made by various colleagues of mine. Uh, just to name a few, we have got technical team, Mr. Nazir and Mr. Nitin. We have got from economics department, our faculty members such as Kashmira, who is the anchor, Diya Devre, who is the organizer and coordinator, then Dr. Sheena Matthews, who is overseeing all these activities, and naturally the head of the department, Dr. Sunaini Parture, as well as Dr. Marcel Samuel, who is the banking head. Their efforts are actually fetching good fruits in this kind of difficult situations. So I wish once again welcome. I wish basically all the success for this webinar, and once again I welcome you all for this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Soman. Today, we have the privilege to have with us Dr. Ashish Kulkarni as the guest speaker, who is a well-known faculty at the prestigious Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. Sir has been a visiting faculty in various esteemed colleges across Pune and Bangalore. His areas of interest are macroeconomics, econometrics, financial modeling, and economic research. Sir has an extensive corporate experience and has worked at Genpact, Fidelity Investments, and Suzlon. He has been instrumental in setting up an economic research cell focusing on global economic changes, exchange rate analysis, and interest rate forecasting at Suzlon. He believes in making economics more interesting. He also asserts that one needs to synthesize knowledge rather than merely transferring it. Sir is a very popular with his students due to his innovative and intuitive techniques of pedagogy. Today, he will elaborate on a topic that interests most of us and is quite relevant in the wake of the pandemic. Sir, it is an honor to have you with us. May I now request Dr. Kulkarni to share his thoughts and enlighten us on the monetary policy during crisis with special reference to COVID-19. Over to you, sir.
Dr. Soman, Diya, Kashmira, Nitin, all of you, thank you so much for making this happen. Thanks also to Dr. Sunani Parzuri and Dr. Marcel Samuel for inviting me to give this talk. What I'm going to do is use a presentation, but I'm guessing if you've attended classes conducted by me, you know how much of a fan I am of endless presentations. So while the presentation is there, I would much rather that this is an interactive session and you ask me whatever questions you want. Of course, about the topic that we're going to be speaking about today, but for that matter about anything else under the sun as well. I'll begin by using the presentation, but I'll check in every now and then to take a look at whatever questions you guys have. Feel free to use the question and answer section to ask pretty much whatever questions you want. And roughly every 10 minutes or so over the course of the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'll be checking in to check whatever questions you've asked and try and answer them. And towards the end of the session, we'll have a dedicated Q&A session as well. So without further ado, let's get started with the presentation itself. So what I'm going to be speaking about today is, as Diya already explained, monetary policy during a pandemic. And of course, when I say pandemic, there is only one pandemic that is on our minds right now, and that is COVID-19, and the scary and also equally fascinating way in which it has taken over the world. So while the title itself of the presentation speaks about a pandemic, the topic is rather more specific than that. It is about monetary policy during the times of COVID-19. I'm going to divide this into two separate sections. Not sure who it is, but could everybody mute their microphones, please? Thank you. Okay, so monetary policy during a pandemic, I'm going to divide this into two sections. One is the theory of what monetary policy ought to be like during a time of crisis and what it has actually been like, especially in India over the course of the last 3 months or so. And that's a broad division between what I'm going to be speaking about today. Let's begin by taking a look at a couple of charts, well, 3 charts that I have taken from a website called Fred St. Louis. Again, those of you who attended my classes, whether the Symbiosis College of Arts and Commerce or elsewhere, will know that I'm practically addicted to this website. Great set of data visualizations, and I would strongly encourage you to visit this website to get a sense of what is going on in the world, particularly from an American viewpoint during the last 3 months or so. What you're taking a look at right now is the effective federal funds rate. Think of it as the interest rate set by the Federal Reserve for the American economy, although it's slightly more complicated than that. When we speak about the federal funds rate, there are a couple of things that you need to take a look at in this chart. This blue line shows you what interest rates have been like in America over the course of the last, roughly speaking, 45 years or so. When I say 45 years, this is from the year 2000, going backward 45 years until 1955. The gray bars that you see on the screen are US recessions as declared by the National Bureau of Economic Research. So there's a recession in around 1955-56, another recession in 1961-62, and so on and so forth. Now, we'll get to the more modern chart in just a little while, but what I want you to take a look at over here and what I want you to understand is monetary policy usually reacts to a crisis, as you would expect, by cutting interest rates. This will be so familiar to students of economics that it will almost be platitudinal. It's kind of saying that the sun rises from the east, hona hi hai. But for the benefit of those who are not familiar with exactly why this might happen, a very quick explainer. You want to cut interest rates during a crisis for 2 reasons. One, so as to drive up consumption, make it easier for consumers to borrow so as to be able to purchase more stuff. Second, you want to cut interest rates so as to drive up investment. And the idea behind that is a lower rate of interest applicable for borrowing will incentivize people to invest more so long as they anticipate that the rate of return from their investment will be higher than the rate at which they have borrowed. Long story short, cutting interest rates is always a good idea during a crisis. And as you can see in each of the gray bars, there has been a reduction of interest rates after the crisis has started. Sometimes it takes longer. So for example, monetary policy clearly wasn't on 5th gear, so to speak, during the early part of the 1975 crisis, as you might see over here. But in almost every other case, interest rates decline, and in some surprising cases, they continue to decline even after the recession has been over. That's the long-term view. Now let's narrow down our frame of reference and take a look at the period in the 21st century, beginning from the year 2000 up until the year 2020. There is one major reason why I would want to take a look at this chart in slightly greater detail. And the reason I want to do that is twofold. One, because when you take a look at interest rates for the entire period of the 20th century, very rarely, if at all, did they come anywhere close to zero. It happened, if you think about it, in the first 2 recessions. But after that, interest rates, while they were reduced, never came down to zero. They came down pretty close to zero in the 2008 crisis. And the second reason why I want to spend a little bit of more time over here is because you might want to make the claim that in a way the interest rate reductions during the 2001 crisis sort of sowed the seeds for the crisis that happened in the year 2008. If you are interested in figuring out, say, for example, what were the origins or the potential causes of the 2008 recession, one thing that may have exacerbated the onset of the crisis was the fact that interest rates remained low for far too long, even after the recession got over. And moving one chart forward, one slide forward, if you take a look at where interest rates are now in America, beginning around April 2020, they've been cut to, for all intents and purposes, nearly zero, and they're likely to stay here for the foreseeable future. for obvious reasons. But to circle back to what we are taking a look at in terms of the movements of interest rates during the 21st century, you will see that they were mostly zero or close enough to zero beginning around the year 2009, and they stayed close to zero up until the onset of early 2016. And you might argue that from 2016 up until today, America was staging somewhat of a recovery. If you take a look at the movement of the interest rates, they seem to be on an upward trend and had in fact made their way past a little bit beyond 2% around 2018 and 2019. But over the last 3 months or so, not only have they been declining, but they are now back to almost zero levels. So if you take a look at what America has been going through for the last, roughly speaking, 65 years or so, you get a sense of an economy that is going to respond to a crisis by cutting interest rates. And the simplest expectation, therefore, that you might have is that any economy that is struck by a crisis will want to reduce interest rates during such a crisis. That would be a pretty short presentation, and you might have thought that we might all be able to go home right now because, well, what is monetary policy like during a pandemic? It is a cutting of interest rates. Not really. There is a whole lot of other things that also need to go on in terms of policy making, and those are the things that we're going to take a look at in just a little while. But the biggest takeaway, the most important thing that you can realize during a crisis such as this is the first thing that needs to happen is a softening or a reduction of interest rates. Before we get to what India has done and why it has done whatever it has done and whether it has succeeded in whatever it has done, let's take a look at how to think about a crisis such as this. I'll share the presentation with all of you towards the end of today's talk, but this quotation that I've put up on the slide right now was taken from a lovely article written on the Federal Reserve of Bank of Dallas. And all of you can read, so I'm not going to read out the entire quote that I put up over here, but I wanted to speak a little bit about analogies and how to think about the current crisis. So the author of this piece says that you might want to think of COVID-19 and all of the restrictions, the lockdown, the quarantine, the stay-at-home warnings, whatever they may be, think of them as a severe winter storm. So in much the same way that workers can't go to their jobs, customers can't walk into restaurants, into pubs, into movie halls, into malls, whatever it may be, because of bad weather. So it's not as if equipment is damaged. It's not as if there is an infrastructural crisis. It's not as if there is anything that is inherently wrong with whatever is already been produced. It is simply the fact that the economy can't function because people are at home. And as a consequence, the kicker comes towards the end of the slide. Both supply and demand, whether in a retail sense or whether in an aggregate sense, are adversely or negatively affected. The only thing that I would say in opposition to what is put up on the quote over here is rarely does a winter storm last for as long as the coronavirus crisis has already lasted. And in fact, as all of you are aware, the coronavirus crisis is likely to stay with us for rather more time to come. So if you're looking at guesstimates, which is always a dangerous game to play, it's easy enough to say that for the next 3 months at least, the economy will continue to remain subdued, even though we are in some sort of an end to the lockdown phase. But normal business activity will, safe to say, not resume for the next 3 months at least. And if you ask me for my personal opinion, for most of the coming year, business activity will remain subdued in various parts of the country and indeed the world for around 12 to 15 months. I hope I'm wrong, but it's almost certain that this is likely to happen. That's one part. The second part that you need to understand in terms of how the coronavirus crisis is a crisis that is unlike any of the crises that we've seen so far is because of the uncertainty. So I spoke about it right now when I said 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 15 months, who really knows? That has an impact beyond the negative impact that is seen in the last sentence of this particular slide. So it's bad enough that supply and demand are negatively affected, but forward looking, that is, in terms of what you expect to happen in the future, also there are likely to be negative impacts. And as a consequence, you are likely to see great uncertainty in terms of both decisions taken by consumers as well as decisions taken by investors in terms of what is going to happen in the Indian economy as well as the global economy going forward. Think of it this way. Are you likely to want to say, for example, start a new business, a new restaurant, rent a new shop in a mall, whatever it may be in the coming year? Almost certainly not. And as a consequence, it's not just the fact that businesses have been negatively impacted in the 3 months leading up to today. but it is almost certainly the case that businesses will continue to be negatively impacted in the years to come. Sorry, my fault, in the months to come as well. So it's not just the fact that supply and demand are adversely affected. It is also the fact that supply and demand are going to be affected from a forward-looking perspective. Continuing from that same article, another thing that I would really like to speak about and touch upon is the fact that you want to think of something that every economics professor loves to speak about, opportunity costs. So what do I mean when I say you want to think about opportunity costs? As this particular quote taken from the same article says, any political leader, not just in India, but the world over, will want to think about the costs of the disease itself. So something that we're all painfully familiar with right now, and unfortunately are going to get much more familiar with in the days to come. The costs of fighting the disease in terms of health, in terms of mental health issues, in terms of equipment, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But against that, what is the price that we have paid in terms of maintaining the lockdown that we did in the months of March, April, May, and to some extent in June? So it's one thing to speak about the cost of combating the disease, and it's another thing to think about the cost of disease prevention. And that payoff between these two things is really the crux, the heart of the issue over here. How can monetary policy specifically help? Monetary policy can help if it tries to the extent possible, mitigate the economic damage. Please understand, the monetary policy by itself cannot, it simply can't combat coronavirus or its ill effects. But what it can do is it can, to the extent possible, make it easier for the lockdown to be lifted as soon as possible. So if you can figure out a way in which to help the economy by using monetary policy, mitigate the ill effects, then that means that you can continue to combat the coronavirus for slightly longer. The thing that you want to keep in mind is when you analyze something like this is how can monetary policy help in terms of providing succor, in terms of providing assistance to the people who have been negatively impacted because of the lockdown. That ought to be front and foremost at the heart and the mind of any monetary policy authority anywhere in the world. So all of that being said, now let's take a look at what actually has not been addressed enough when you speak about monetary policy from a global perspective. And it is the fact that there are limitations to monetary policy. First and foremost, if you go back to the previous slide, the thing that you want to focus on over here is the word mitigate. As I mentioned a little while earlier, it is simply not going to be possible for monetary policy authorities and indeed for monetary policy to combat the virus per se, or to combat the ill effects of the virus. All we can do is mitigate the economic damage, but it can't in any way reduce the negative impacts of the coronavirus. And one way to think about it is monetary policy is at best a band-aid. It is a tool that will mitigate the damage. Most of the heavy lifting in the days to come will have to be done by fiscal policy rather than monetary policy. And there simply is no alternative to that. That's one component. The second component is, unfortunately, monetary policy is mostly a very blunt tool. And what do I mean when I say it is a blunt tool? If you want to focus on the poorest sections of society, if you want to make sure that the people who need help the most are likely to get it first, or people who need help the most are the only ones who are going to get it, then monetary policy perhaps isn't the best tool to use. Fiscal policy is able to handle redistributional consequences much better. So you can say that people up until a certain income will get certain kinds of aids. People up until a certain stage of the ability to pay tax will get a higher refund or whatever it may be. Fiscal policy, long story short, is able to counteract the negative impacts much better if you want to focus on redistribution. Monetary policies, not always, but by definition will apply to the entire population. And so one limitation, one drawback of monetary policy is it is a blunter tool than fiscal policy. And you can think of the last component that I put up on the slide, both from a negative perspective and a positive perspective. But the thing that you need to understand the most is monetary policy is best thought of as a signal. And what I mean by that is when you reduce the rate of interest, or when the governor of the RBI or the governor of the Federal Reserve makes a statement saying that I commit to XYZ for a certain period of time, it sends a signal about what people should expect in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. That signal, the negative way of thinking about it is most of monetary policy really is a signal to the market. and little more than that. But the good news is, so long as people believe in that signal, they might then make decisions that have ramifications for a very long period of time to come. Monetary policy is, yes, mostly about signaling. And perhaps if you ask me, the best way to learn about this is to try and decode what Alan Greenspan used to say in his press conferences, or read his autobiography, if you will. But really, monetary policy is a signal from the authorities about what they are going to do, a commitment about what they are going to do in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. And that signal can be thought of in both, as I said, a negative and a positive perspective. But to the extent that it is mostly about signaling, you might want to think of that as a negative as well. So with all these caveats in mind, that it is a band-aid, that it is a blunt tool, and that it is mostly about signaling, let's now go ahead and dive into the details of exactly what it was that India has done in terms of combating the coronavirus using monetary policy. Before I do that though, let me quickly take a look at whether there are any questions in the question and answer section. If there are, I'll try and answer them as quickly as possible. So far, thankfully, there are no questions. So let's go back and take a look at the monetary policy measures adopted by India to combat the coronavirus. So as in the case of the federal funds rate by the Federal Reserve, so also in the case of India, there have been multiple reductions in both the repo and the reverse repo. There have been tweaks to how the repo and the reverse repo are going to be reduced. I won't get into all of the details right now, but the first and the most important thing that the Reserve Bank of India has done is it has reduced the rate of interest that is applicable in the economy. And all of us are seeing knock-on effects of this to follow, both in terms of being investors or depositors, but also in terms of taking loans from financial institutions. So there already has been, and there will continue to be in the future, a dramatic softening of interest rates in the economy. One component. The second component is long-term repo operations. These are fairly complicated things to speak about. For the moment, for this slide, I'm going to take a rain check on this particular initiative. And the reason I'm going to take a rain check on this particular initiative right now is because in the next slide, I'm going to speak about it in much greater detail. So for the moment, I won't address what LTROs are, but I'll speak about TLTROs, something known as targeted long-term repo operations, in the next slide, and explain what the intent is, why it failed, and why modifications have been necessary in LTROs in a couple of minutes. Apart from that, CRR has been cut, the cash reserve ratio has been cut. All of the information is available easily online, so I'm not going to get into the details of exactly how much it has been cut in terms of both the repo as well as the CRR. But essentially, the thing that I want you to understand is a large amount of monetary policy tools have been pressed into deployment ever since the lockdown started in India. The biggest of which has been the reduction in the rate of interest and, as I mentioned, LTROs. There has been an increase in the marginal standing facility as well. Essentially, the ability for banks to offtake or to take money from the Reserve Bank of India. It has been made as easy as possible for banks to be flushed with liquidity. Each of these are fantastic moves, and something that all of us are also already familiar with in one way or the other, whether affected by it personally or affected by it in terms of reading about it in the news. Loan moratoriums have been announced. Effectively, people don't need to repay loans for 3 months. Interest need not be paid for those 3 months as well. However, after the moratorium period is over, not only will you have to repay whatever it is that you were supposed to repay, but the interest for those 3 months will also be applicable. There has been some controversy about this as regards to some judgments from our courts recently, and I'll get into that in just a little while. Apart from that, SEBI relaxed, and this happened, if I remember correctly, in late March, early April, although I may have got the dates wrong. SEBI announced a relaxation for debt defaults, effectively makes it possible for companies to not have to announce a default on their debt right away. And capital conservation buffers have also been delayed. So this basically is a move that allows banks to not have to deploy capital to comply with norms that have been set up by the Reserve Bank of India. So these capital conservation buffers have been delayed by 6 months, and that allows banks to not be as stringent as the Reserve Bank of India would have wanted them to be before the coronavirus crisis struck. If you take a look at each of these moves that have been announced, each of these moves is about making it easy, as easy as possible for the financial sector in India to recover as quickly as possible from the negative impact of the COVID crisis. In terms of each of the policy measures that you have seen right now, I would argue, in my personal opinion, the one that is actually the most important for India, especially for its knock-on effects, not just within the formal banking sector, but the informal banking sector, has been LTROs. And in terms of helping you understand what LTROs are, let's take a look at, as I promised you in the earlier slide, let's take a look at LTRO expansion and modification. And here is where the story gets a little tricky. So what exactly is the story and why does it get tricky? And why do I think this is one of the more important monetary policy measures that has been announced by the Reserve Bank of India? First things first, what you effectively want to do is you want to be able to provide help to people who have borrowed but find themselves unable to repay. For that reason, what the Reserve Bank of India did is it said to NBFCs, you know what, like with banks, so also with you guys, if people have borrowed from you, then it should be possible for those people to not have to repay you for 3 months, which is on the face of it, both an extremely good idea and especially over the course of the last 3 months, an extremely necessary one. Here's the problem though. Think about a company like, say, for example, Bajaj Finance. If you think about the period March, April and May, a lot of people have taken loans from Bajaj Finance. So I didn't, but let's hypothesize that I did. Let's assume that I took a loan to buy, say, for example, a flat screen TV at home or a refrigerator at home. I'm giving you deliberately a very small scale example. Of course, the kind of loans that NBFCs have given out are of a much larger value and to much bigger entities than, say, for example, Ashish Kulkarni's household. But for the sake of an example that all of us can identify with, think of my household having decided to take a loan from Bajaj Finance and purchase, like I said, say, for example, a flat screen TV. And now the Reserve Bank of India says, all right, now for the next 3 months, Ashish, you don't need to repay the loan, nor the interest, effectively the loan moratorium, if you so choose. And I say, cool, all right, I'm not going to repay the loan. Like me, there might be hundreds of other investors, sorry, my fault, borrowers, whether it is individuals or companies, who have also decided to not take up the ability to repay their loans for the next 3 months. Ask yourself a question, however, where does the NBFC get the money from? So Bajaj Finance ने मुझे लोन तो दे दिया और मैंने वो लोन लेके टीवी खरीद तो लिया, तो विजय सेल्स को अपना पैसा मिला. I didn't have to put up any money of my own, and Bajaj Finance made that money available to me. But what is the source of these funds for Bajaj Finance? Typically, what an NBFC does is an NBFC borrows money in the bond market and then uses that money to be able to give out as loans. So if I don't repay for 3 months to Bajaj Finance will therefore naturally not have any money to repay the loan that it has taken. And while there was a moratorium on loans being repaid to NBFCs, unfortunately, there was no moratorium on NBFCs having to honor its bonds. And if an NBFC does not honor its bond obligations, then that bond is treated as being defaulted. And if the bond market, players in the bond market start to default, then that's a pretty big crisis for India to handle. So what can be done? It's not exactly the same story, but something like this happened in the year 2008 in America as well. Like I said, the details are slightly different, but what happened in that particular case is the Reserve Bank of India, sorry, my fault, the Federal Reserve in America stepped in and said, all right, we will purchase some of these assets. This is, of course, the famous or infamous Troubled Asset Relief Program. However you want to think about it, effectively, the Troubled Asset Relief Program was the Federal Reserve's attempt to purchase these financial assets. The Reserve Bank of India, for a variety of reasons, cannot and does not want to get into this particular game right now. So what they did instead is they said, all right, we will allow banks to borrow from us so long as these banks use the funds that have been lent to them to give help to NBFCs. And there were a whole host of complicated rules that were set up in terms of how the NBFCs would be repaid by banks, what kind of exposure each bank would take, and so on and so forth. But effectively, it meant risk would pass on from the NBFCs onto the banks. Except if you think about it, banks would not really want to take on this risk because what is a guarantee that the banks will be made whole if these companies or bonds start to default? For this reason, the first LTRO that was launched was in some senses a dramatic failure, which is why since then the Reserve Bank of India has launched, if I'm not mistaken, 2 other TLTROs or targeted long-term repo operations in order to help the NBFC sector. Now, the reason I wanted to spend so much time speaking about this specifically in slightly greater detail is because we need to understand that it is not just the banking sector that is going to be responsible for most of the troubles that A, have already started and B, will start in the months to come in India's financial sector. It is mostly the non-banking financial companies that might end up seeing some major problems in the months to come. And for that reason, what happens in terms of LTROs, targeted LTROs, is going to be pretty complicated. If you want a simple, very easy to understand article written about this, I would heavily recommend that you visit a website called capitalmind.in. That's capitalmind.in, capitalmind.in, and search for LTROs. There's a whole host of articles that you can read about this, of course, but to my mind, this website has the best, most easily understood explainer about what is the LTRO and why it is so very important. There are other measures that have also been launched. So refinancing facilities have been made available. There has been a reduction in liquidity coverage ratios, which effectively is once again the ability for banks to not have to deplete their funds in order to meet compliance requirements. There has been a standstill on asset classification. So effectively what has happened is the Reserve Bank of India has allowed some relaxation in terms of whether an asset ought to be classified as a non-performing asset or not. And the most important thing from a government financing viewpoint is there has been a dramatic increase in the ways and means advances, both at the state and the central level, so that states and centers can effectively use this particular channel to avail themselves of funds, which, as you can imagine, is something that is going to have to happen perhaps even more in the days and weeks to come. Along with this, SEBI has announced relaxation for debt defaults. And there has been special liquidity facility schemes that have been available, that has been made available for mutual funds. Here's the thing that you might want to understand in terms of not the nitty-gritties, although we can get into that if you like, but in terms of the big picture details, what you need to understand is there are a whole host of things beyond this also that the Reserve Bank of India has been actively doing. But try and think of it as three big ticket items. The three big ticket items are interest rates have been reduced to the extent possible and will be reduced, if you ask me, in the days and weeks to come as well. Number one. Second, a clear signal has been sent to the markets, both through speeches as well as through actions, that the Reserve Bank of India stands ready and willing to do whatever it takes in order to help out the people of India, its firms, its business sectors. So the signaling is really and truly important. And third, the Reserve Bank of India is working very closely with the Government of India in terms of stepping up and providing whatever support is needed. It is a job of the Reserve Bank of India to be at odds with the Government of India. And I say that only half jokingly. But during times of crisis, it is crucial, it is important that both monetary and financial policy making work hand in glove to make sure that there is some sort of coordination at the highest level. And if you ask me my personal opinion, the Reserve Bank of India has more than done its fair share and stands ready to do more work in the years to come. Sorry, my fault, in the months to come in terms of providing support. The biggest problem that is going to come is in terms of making sure that the NBFC sector is not too negatively impacted by what has happened. That's the first challenge. And the second challenge is to make sure that the real estate sector and all the ancillary sectors associated with it are not negatively impacted. But I'm rather more skeptical about the Reserve Bank of India's ability to handle this particular crisis, not because I doubt the Reserve Bank of India, but because I think the real estate sector in India is much, much more problematic than even the ability of the Reserve Bank of India to contain it. So that's something that I've not actually spoken about in this slide, the impact on the real estate sector and what the Reserve Bank of India might do to be able to counteract the negative impact. One recommendation that I would make for those of you who are interested in reading more about this, Ira Duggal, who writes on Bloomberg Quint, has a series of excellent articles on this, especially about relaxations given to specifically real estate companies. Follow her on Twitter, read her work on Bloomberg Quint, although it's a paid website, but her Twitter account is very easily followed, and I would recommend it's a good source for you to keep yourself abreast of what is going on specifically with regard to the real estate sector in India and how it likely will be more problematic in the times to come. So each of these, as I mentioned, are specific initiatives taken by the Reserve Bank of India. But this also begs the question of what is likely to happen next. When I say what is likely to happen next, I don't mean what is likely to happen next in terms of the coronavirus crisis. That's so much up for grabs. There's so much uncertainty about this that we don't really know what is going to happen. But I try to answer this question specifically in terms of what the Reserve Bank of India might be able to do next. So what might it be able to do next? This is something that they already did last year after the recommendations of Bimal Jalan committee. But it might be possible that some of the some of the surpluses on the Reserve Bank of India's balance sheet might be transferred over to the government. I'm not saying this will happen. I'm not saying this should happen. But I am saying that this is one of the big ticket options that is available to the Reserve Bank of India if the need arises in the days, weeks and months to come. Second, some of this has already started to happen. Cooperative banks are now under the regulatory ambit of the Reserve Bank of India. And the reason I haven't applied a question mark over here is because, like I said, some of these regulatory changes have already started to happen. But that's, in a sense, what is going to happen next. There will be a large amount of shifting of regulatory burdens and responsibilities in terms of which sectors are going to be hardest hit, and they might come under direct supervision of the Reserve Bank of India. There have been multiple articles on multiple websites suggesting that you might want to monetize deficits directly in India. That is, the Reserve Bank of India, in a much more direct sense, provides support to the Indian government. This, if you think about it, hasn't really happened since the year 1997. However, under current circumstances, it is actually not just possible, but some people would argue even desirable to monetize a deficit in the days, weeks and months to come, and for the Indian government, therefore, to provide support. This is necessary for two reasons. One, because this crisis is likely to become so bad that such a dramatic step will have to be taken. Second, this is also a callback to an earlier point that I made earlier on this talk. Because fiscal policy is a much less blunt tool than is monetary policy, it perhaps makes sense for monetary policy to aid, in a sense, fiscal policy, and for fiscal policy to do much of the heavy lifting when it comes to actually interacting with India's population. And finally, who knows, if TLTROs don't really work the way they are supposed to, it might actually end up being the case that there'll be a direct asset purchase program, and it might end up being so that the Reserve Bank of India steps in and directly starts to purchase financial assets. It hasn't happened yet. Hopefully, the time will not come for a direct lifting by the RBI, but it is entirely possible that something like this may happen in the near future. So in terms of big ticket items, anticipate each of these four to be major problems in the time to come. Will interest rates be cut further? Almost inevitably so. There is likely in my mind no alternative to that particular step. But apart from interest rates being cut and apart from all of what you've seen in the previous two slides happening again, either with a strengthened dose or with some new initiatives, these are the four big ticket items that perhaps are likely to materialize. Right, that's all I have in terms of presentation, and I would really like to spend as much time as possible in answering whatever questions all of you have. Like I said, first let's begin with the monetary policy questions, and then pretty much whatever questions you want to ask me, I'm more than up for it. So please start sending in your questions and I'll try and answer them to the extent possible. Okay, let's begin taking a look at questions one by one. The first question that I'll try and answer was one that was raised by Rohit Ranjan. Will Atmanirbhar Bharat ignite the economy? Rohit, this question is a little difficult to answer because I am not quite sure about whether Atmanirbhar Bharat will ignite the economy, and for three separate reasons. The first reason I'm not so sure this will happen is because, as we just discussed, the economy is going through a bit of a crisis. So igniting is rather a big word to use under these particular circumstances. Two, global supply chains are such that whether you like it or not, manufacturing is deeply dependent on the ability of goods to move, not just in a finished sense, but in a semi-finished sense across borders. So you'd be surprised to see how the manufacture of, say, for example, laptops or microphones or headphones, and those are just three things that I'm literally using right now, is dependent on certain goods and commodities moving across borders. we live in a very interdependent world, and although most economies in the world will want to try and rebalance the economy by being more internally located, there still will have to be a large amount of flow of goods and services. So one, because of the crisis. Second, because we are dealing with an economy that is very, very dependent on cross-border flows. And third, because for Atmanirbhar Bharat to work, it has to be the case that the government will deregulate much, much faster than it has done pretty much since India's independence. So for these three reasons, while I remain hopeful that this will actually work and I will be proven wrong, my experience both working as an economist and as a student of the Indian economy makes me think that this likely will not be the case. If there's a follow-up question, Rohit, please let me know and I'll try and answer it. Okay, that's one. Anonymous asks the question to which I'm going to say right now, I don't have an answer. I don't think anybody does. The question is, why do you think the stock market is rising even during the crisis? The possibility of a crash is also high, right? Yes, the possibility for crash is high. I honestly don't have an answer, and I've been saying this for a year now. By all logical measures, the stock market should not be rising as much as it is right now. So you might say that the stock market is a forward-looking measure and that people are optimistic about how quickly India will return to some sort of a new normal. But as an economist, I honestly don't know why it is the case that the stock market is rising even during this crisis. I think it is being a little more optimistic than it ought to be. But who knows? I'm wrong. Okay, anonymous, somebody else, presumably, who's also chosen not to name themselves, has a question. What do we think about the employment levels in the world with specific reference to countries like India in the short and the long run? There are articles over the last couple of days about how unemployment in India is, in a sense, coming back to its pre-lockdown levels. Just excuse me 1 second. Mihu. Okay, I'm sorry about that. It's the pitfalls of conducting seminars from at home. So the other anonymous question that was asked was about employment levels in the world with specific reference to countries like India in the short and the long run. When you think about employment levels in not just the world, but specifically in India, employment levels are actually, it would seem, back to, if not the pre-coronavirus levels, at least close to them. Here's my biggest problem with thinking about employment data, though. It's not specifically about the unemployment in the short run, but much more importantly, it is about the network effects that will likely be lost if unemployment persists. And let me clarify what I mean by that. So as a hypothetical, and for my own sake, I hope this does not happen, but imagine for a second that we have a situation where Gokhale Institute fires me. It's possible during the lockdown, for whatever reasons, Gokhale Institute says it is not able to maintain the same level of staffing that it had earlier. And so I am let go. Which is bad news for me. In the long run, it might end up being bad news for Gokhale Institute because the work that I did, somebody else will eventually be able to do. But whatever it is that I bring to the company in terms of networks, in terms of contacts, in terms of my own personal processes, it will take time for my replacement. Whenever that replacement is hired by Gokhale Institute in the future, it'll take time for that replacement to come up to speed. So even if employment comes back to its original levels, it may not be the case that the economy is as productive as it was earlier. So it's one thing to say that the same number of people are employed, but it is quite another to say that the economy is operating at the same level of productivity. If I take up somebody else's job 1 year down the line in a new firm, it'll take me between 3 to 6 months to get a sense of what is expected of me, what the processes are, the ins and outs of the job, and so on and so forth. In other words, what I'm trying to explain is I'm not so worried about employment levels per se or unemployment levels per se. What I am worried about is the loss of knowledge in the economy, and that likely will have a much more negative impact. Don't think of jobs as something that you can magically switch between and start to be as productive as you were earlier. There is a learning process involved on these jobs, and that learning process will therefore naturally take time. And in some cases, older people simply can't adjust to the new kinds of jobs that might be expected. So I love to use cricketing examples, but it's a little bit like, say, for example, Sachin Tendulkar being asked to play T20 cricket or 100 cricket, if you're familiar with this new abomination that the English Cricket Board is considering launching. So people who've been trained in a specific kind of job, it's unreasonable to expect them to automatically adjust to a new job. So to me, the bigger concern is not unemployment per se. It is, like I said, the loss of knowledge. Would there be a boom in demand as soon as the lockdown is lifted? Since from a behavioral perspective, people will want to get out of their house and buy, etc. Yes. So imagine a world in which on the 26th of June 2020, that is tomorrow, suddenly somehow magically everybody is cured of the coronavirus, that either a vaccine comes which is 100% effective or a cure comes, which means that even if you get the virus, there is no need to worry. It hasn't happened yet, but imagine for a second that something like this happens. Will there be a huge spurt in the economy in terms of consumption? Yes, absolutely, it will be. The only problem with all of what I've just said is neither the cure nor the vaccine are anywhere close to being deployed. And in my personal opinion, I don't think a cure or a vaccine is going to be out anytime soon. This takes me into deeper waters than I have any level of expertise in. So I might be completely wrong about the time frame for the cure and the vaccine, but I don't see it coming anytime soon. That's my only problem with this particular question. Outside of that, sure, I agree with you. As soon as the virus one way or the other ends, there will be a huge spurt in demand. How the virus ends is the $1 million question. Amit Joshi has a question. What kind of blending of fiscal and monetary policy is desirable for the economy to minimize the loss arising due to the crisis? Amit, great question. I would recommend, or I would argue that monetary policy should play more of a supporting role. So whether it is through the monetization of deficits, whether it is through increasing WMA and making funds available for governments to spend, for reasons that I've already discussed in the seminar, I think it makes much more sense to have monetary policy support a much wider deployment of fiscal policy. And so if you're asking me, it's kind of like a captain vice captain relationship where the captain is fiscal policy and monetary policy is the vice captain. Stuti has a question. What do you think about employment? Was the same question that was asked earlier. So I'll skip this. It was about employment. Sachin has a question. What are your views on the issue that when financial markets are under stress, steps taken by the central bank for market stability and revival of economic growth are enough? Right now, Sachin, if I've understood your question correctly, you're asking me whether the steps that have been taken are enough. I think the Reserve Bank of India in particular has done as much as it can. I'm aware Mansi gave a talk yesterday about fiscal policy. While I'm not aware of the exact specifics of what she spoke about, and I'm not sure of the stance that she took, in my opinion, fiscal policy can and should do a lot more in the days to come. Things are going to get worse before they get better, and whatever support fiscal policy has already provided is a good start, but much more needs to be done in the days to come. Deepesh has a question. What should be strategy for investments in stock markets? What will be and what should be the investment strategy of foreign investors? I'm going to skip answering the first question, Deepesh, because this is not about recommending either a strategy for specific stocks or, for that matter, a portfolio recommendation. So I'm not going to try and answer the question of what should be the strategy for investments, except to give you not advice, but tell you about what I have done. So far, I have not withdrawn any money from any of my investments. I've decided to stay put. That is not a recommendation that you do the same thing, but rather than explain to you what you should do, I'm trying to explain to you what I have done. And I have made some minor investments in the last 3 months or so. But the one thing that I've definitely not done is withdrawn any money. Make what you will of that. What will be or should be the investment strategy of foreign investors? Would you be willing to invest in a foreign economy right now? If I was answering that question, I would say no. I would be very risk averse. And for that same reason, you should expect foreign investors to be roughly speaking risk averse for the next 6 months or so. So not too much of FPI will likely come in for the next 6 months or so. Again, forcing or forecasting for the future is a very dangerous thing to do. But I would expect people, broadly speaking, to be more risk averse than otherwise. Anonymous has a question about whether monetary policy, I'm paraphrasing over here, but he has a question about whether, or she has a question about whether monetary policy will accelerate the pre-COVID trend and increase inflationary pressure. One of my favorite economists to read online has this little dictum, has this little policy or sentence that he often repeats, which roughly goes along the lines of never reason from a price change, What he's saying is, even if inflation might go up in the near future, for us to ascribe causality to that and say that it happened because of monetary policy alone is a rather risky thing to say. So one, we don't know if inflation is going to go up or not in the near future. Second, how much of it will be due to monetary policy is another issue altogether. But third, and much more importantly, even if it does go up, does that or should that be an argument that we should not do monetary policy right now to the extent that we are? I would say no. Right now, it's a crisis situation, all hands on deck. Whatever needs to be done in terms of providing support to the economy needs to be done. If it means that there might be inflationary risks in the near or medium future, that's a price that we simply have to pay. It's a little bit like, I mean, forgive the analogy because it is not the most happy analogy that you can think of. But if there is, say, for example, cancer present in a human body, then chemotherapy becomes necessary. Will it have serious side effects? Sure. But right now, the problem is the cancer. Similarly, when you think about the economy, the first challenge is to deal with the COVID crisis. If that means that there'll be side effects either now or later, that's a price that we have to be willing to pay. In the context of developing countries at this point of time, Akash asks, which policy shall play the key role to offset the ill effect of COVID? I've already answered this question, Akash. I would say it should be fiscal policy, in my personal opinion. Which monetary policies India will execute? Sharmishta asks if any companies come up for investments. I'm not sure what the answer to this particular question is, Sharmishta, because I'm not sure about what question you have asked. If you're asking what monetary policies will India execute to help companies come up for investments, the obvious answer is a softening of interest rates, but I'm not sure I've understood your question. So if you can repeat it or clarify it below, I'll try and answer it towards the end. Which monetary policies India will execute? Again, it's the same question, so I won't answer it right now. Are we not going to enter a liquidity trap if we keep lowering our interest rate along with heavy losses in the bond market? I would argue that's a bit of a misunderstanding of what a liquidity trap is. It doesn't happen because you lower interest rates. Interest rates are lowered because you are, in one sense or the other, in a liquidity trap. But no, we are not going to enter a liquidity trap because we have kept lowering our interest rates. In fact, if anything, we need to, if you ask me, lower interest rates even further because demand is going to take a bit more of a beating in the months to come. Devopriya Sarkar asks if the interest rate is low and common people who are in need of money can easily borrow money. But then if in the years to come rates increase, then common people will be able to refund the money along with high interest. Or whether there'll be a large amount of defaulters. Defaults will almost certainly go up, Devopriya. I'm not sure I've understood your question about borrowing money right now and then refunding the money along with higher rate of interest. Will defaults go up? That's a safe question to answer. Yes, they'll almost certainly go up. How will banks tackle the problem? Banks will tackle the problem in the way that they already are because of guidance and concrete action provided by the Reserve Bank of India. There is a lot of relaxation in terms of how to structure defaults, in terms of what kind of money to be kept aside to handle defaults and so on and so forth. But defaults are definitely going to go up. Ram Gopal asks, I mentioned that deficits have not been monetized since 1997 because that is when the agreement was signed between the Reserve Bank of India and the central government, effectively disbarring the ability to monetize deficits. There are loopholes or exit clauses in that agreement, and Ram Gopal, I think those exit clauses should be applicable now. Parlisha asks if monetizing deficit could lead to inflation in the coming future. Certainly possible. I'm not ignoring the possibility, but like I said, it's more about staying alive right now than worrying what happens later. Should there be slashing of CRR further down and will it prove to be beneficial is what Piyush asks. Sure, it almost certainly is going to happen. Deepesh asks if Atmanirbhar Bharat will affect foreign companies. Too soon to say, Deepesh, but largely speaking, I feel safe in saying there will be a somewhat of a negative impact on foreign companies. Anonymous asks me to explain LTROs once again. I can't go into it in the same amount of details that I did earlier, Anonymous. However, I would recommend that you try and visit the capitalmind.in website. Also, my email address I'm sure will be shared with you. Just in case any of you do not have it, it's ashish@econforeverybody.com. Drop me an email and I'll try and both send you the link or try and explain it in greater detail. I'm going to skip questions that ask me to repeat what I've already done. And also, Dia, please let me know how we're doing on time. I'll stop whenever you say stop. Otherwise, I'm happy
Yes,
to
sir.
keep.
We
We're
do
good
have
for
five
time?
minutes more. We
Fantastic.
do have
Okay.
5 minutes.
All right. So Shreya Khuntia from SYBCom Banking asks, what measures can the tourism sector take in order to get back on its toes? Shreya, none. And when I say none, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to be funny or anything like that. People are just not going to want to visit for locations, whether domestically or abroad right now. So the tourism sector is the sector that is going to be, in my opinion, the worst hit by the coronavirus crisis. So apart from providing some sort of support to its own employees, and that also is going to be difficult to do in these times, that's the only thing that can be done. But the tourism sector is going to be very negatively impacted. Like I said, I'll skip questions about deficit financing or LTROs in terms of repeating what I've said. Prasad Barje has a question about interest reduction. Let me read this out. Interest reduction has increased the borrowing capacity and adversely affected the interest income of the depositors. Yes. So it has reduced the money flow in the market. Absolutely. What is the net impact of this? We're already taking a look at the net impact, Prasad. You're looking at a slowdown in terms of deposits into markets, and that's in one sense inevitable because of the lower interest rates being offered. Financial markets are going to struggle both in terms of inflow of deposits as also in terms of offtake of money in terms of loans. So this is a classic recession in which monetary markets, financial markets are going to suffer negatively. Piyush Kumar, as moratorium goes, was a benefit to individual as they'll have to pay more as the interest will be added in their principal amount. I agree, Piyush. It's essentially an ability to help people out during the period when the lockdown was applicable, and when you're not earning any income, you should not have the responsibility of paying out. So there should not be a cash outflow when there is no cash inflow. But somebody somewhere at the end of the day has to pay. That's just how the world works. So the idea was not to do anything else except provide support principally to those people who were not able to earn any income in the last 3 months. But are there negative side effects? Of course there are. Sachin has a question. The credit guarantees that have been provided, will they help? Yes, they will help, Sachin, but as your question seems to imply, to a very limited extent. So it's going to be more of a band-aid, as I mentioned, than anything else. Are the prices of all commodities likely to increase? Asks Anonymous. Who knows, Anonymous? Who knows? Some will increase. So all of us are painfully familiar with petrol and diesel prices going up, for example. And it's fairly easy to say that the price of certain commodities will increase as a consequence of the crisis. But which, to what extent and when? I mean, if I could predict that, I would be sitting on my own beach bungalow in Goa right now. So I don't have the answer to that question. Nobody does. Which banks, public sector, private sector, or cooperative banks are in better position to manage or face the crisis? The $1 million question, Anonymous. It's difficult to say right now. There is, and for a very long time has been, a public perception that cooperative banks will likely be most supported or provided an effective backstop by the government. But in much the same way that a rising tide lifts all boats, a falling tide will make all boats in some way or the other sink a little bit lower. So the same risk profile will attach to all banks, if you ask me. Vasudha asks if political parties are interfering in the work of the Reserve Bank of India. All political parties across all countries, when they are in government, will choose to interfere with the working of the central bank to the extent that they can. And that's always been true. You don't need a coronavirus crisis for that to be true. In this regard, Vasudha, you might want to read a book called Crown of Thorns about the relationship between the Reserve Bank of India and the Indian government from 1955 up until today. Which country, according to me, is doing good in this crisis in terms of the economy? Easy answer, Anonymous, is none. But to a limited extent, I would say Germany has done a good job, both in terms of containment of the crisis, as well as in terms of lifting up restrictions. So if you ask me, Germany, and I mean, everybody is familiar with New Zealand, but it's a relatively speaking, a small economy. Amongst the major economies, in my opinion, Germany. Okay, I'll take two more questions and then I'll stop. One is, sir, do you think there are chances for new norms or regulations in the money market and capital market? Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. And I'll make this the last question by Ayush. It's a very big one, so I'll read this out. TLTROs were launched as a measure to keep NBFCs afloat, yes, and stabilize the bond market by providing funds to banks, true, which act as intermediaries of sorts. Is this truly a wiser option to keep the credit at the bank level rather than what the US Fed is doing by directly buying bonds from these NBFCs? In my opinion, Ayush, what the Reserve Bank of India is doing, at least for the moment, makes more sense because it doesn't want to take on those liabilities onto its own balance sheet. If things get bad, then what you have suggested may actually happen in the future, where there is actually outright asset purchase by the Reserve Bank of India. But I don't think we have reached that stage just yet. That might be something that the Reserve Bank of India will look to do in the future, maybe, but it would much rather not do it until it is unavoidable. And in my personal opinion, I would agree that's the correct thing to do. All right, I'm aware that there are many more questions, but I don't think I'm going to have the time to answer all of them. Once again, my email address is ashish@econforeverybody.com. If you have any doubts, you'd like me to answer them, please feel free to mail in your questions and I'll try and get back as quickly as possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. We really appreciate you for answering the questions posed by the participants. I would now like to propose the vote of thanks on behalf of the Departments of Economics and Banking. We thank Dr. Ashish Kulkarni for making today's webinar a great success and sharing his invaluable thoughts on a very interesting topic. It was indeed an informative session. I would take up this opportunity to thank the principal of our college, Dr. Rishikesh Soman, for always encouraging us and providing us with the requisite platform to conduct the webinar. I thank the head of the Department of Economics, Dr. Sunaini Parjure, head of the Department of Banking, Dr. Marcel Samuel, and my colleagues at the Department of Economics for their continual encouragement. A big thank you to our Symbiosis IT team, Nazir sir and Nitin sir, for making the best arrangements for this program in such a short span of time. Finally, I would thank all the participants who have shown a keen interest in the webinar by participating and making it a grand success.
Right. Thank you so much. Bye.
There is an important announcement for the participants. Participants are requested to fill up the feedback form. The link of the feedback form is available in the Q&A chat box under the Featured tab. The certificates will be generated only if the participants fill the feedback form. I repeat, participants are requested to fill up the feedback form. The link for the feedback form is available in the Q&A chat box under the Featured tab. The certificates will be generated only if the participants fill the feedback form. Thank you, one and all.